Good evening, dear guests, friends of CIOS, conference participants, those who have come from close by and those who have flown from afar, including Ukraine. Welcome to the continuation of a series of events I'm very pleased to welcome you to the Bohdan Bociurkiw Memorial Lecture. Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies was founded in 1976, and as you imagine, we're really approaching now a milestone in a couple of years, the 50th anniversary. We pride ourselves on being built on partnerships and collaborations which have informed the founding of our institute. Those energies have come from the community, from donors, but also, of course, from the academics who have all come together to create this wonderful institution, which nowadays leads in the field of Ukrainian studies globally. In fact, we pride ourselves on being global leaders in the field of Ukrainian studies, and we are very much engaged, in particular in the course of last 2 years, with the beginning of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine in the work to amplify Ukrainian voices and share the wisdom and academic expertise in Ukrainian studies with those who need to hear it. We're gathering on the Treaty 6 territory, the land of many indigenous peoples and Métis peoples as well. We're very proud to be part of this vibrant community, and we're very thankful to our indigenous colleagues, partners, intellectual leaders, and peoples as well for allowing us to collaborate, work, and live and learn on this land. I would be very happy to introduce my dear colleague, Dr. Heather Coleman, the heart and soul of this wonderful conference ahead of us, but also the one who is the director of the Religion and Culture program in the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies, and who is behind all these important and wonderful initiatives. Dr. Heather Coleman is a professor in the Department of History, Classics, and Religion, and she's been with CIOS for very many years. Let's welcome Dr. Heather to kick off this lecture.
Thanks, Natalia. Today, we are delighted to welcome audiences near and far to the opening events of our conference, co-sponsored by the Research Program on Religion and Culture and the Working Group on Lived Religion in Eastern Europe and Eurasia. The war in Ukraine since 2014, and especially since the full-scale Russian invasion in February of 2022, finds a parallel as a religious proxy war. This international, interdisciplinary, and hybrid conference brings together an international slate of speakers to take stock of the profound impact of war on religious life in Ukraine since the invasion. With my co-organizer, Professor Catherine Warner of Pennsylvania State University, who is the convener of the working group, we hoped, as we organized this conference, that we would launch an international conversation both about what we've experienced, but also about the role of the range of Ukrainian religious groups, Orthodox, Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, and Muslim, what role they can play in social reconciliation after the war. The conference is part of a larger project, as Natalia just mentioned, that involves a photographic exhibit that we've brought from Kyiv, the destroyed temples of Ukraine, and you can view that at the Rutherford Library until the end of the month, as well as the publication of a series of interviews on CIUS's online magazine of public affairs, the Forum for Ukrainian Studies. This evening's Bohdan Bociurkiw lecture serves as the opening keynote address for this conference. And I'd just like to say a word or two about the lecture series. Every year, the research program on religion and culture at the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies sponsors the Bohdan Bociurkiw Memorial Lecture. These lectures honor the memory of Professor Bohdan Bociurkiw, one of the founders of the CIUS and an eminent political scientist and internationally renowned specialist on human rights, Soviet religious policy, and the history of the Ukrainian churches. Dr. Bociurkiw began his academic career at the University of Alberta, where he taught in the Department of Political Science from 1956 to 1969. He went on to teach at Carleton University in Ottawa, where he founded the Institute of Soviet and East European Studies, which is now the Institute of European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies. and he served as its first director. A specialist in Soviet politics, with a special emphasis on Soviet Ukraine and church-state relations, he was the author of a great many books and articles. His final book, The Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church and the Soviet State, 1939 to 1950, was published by CIUS Press in 1996, and it remains the authoritative work on the subject in English and has been translated into Ukrainian and is widely read as well. In 1994, Professor Bociurkiw's generous donation of his extensive library and archives to the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies represented the first step in the eventual creation of the research program on religion and culture. The collection contains many unique books, documents pertaining to the Ukrainian Church, including copies from closed archives of the Communist Party and the KGB, and it served as the basis for the program's reference library. The annual Bohdan Bociurkiw Memorial Lecture brings to Edmonton a specialist working in the subject areas that preoccupied Professor Bociurkiw throughout his career: religion and politics and Ukrainians. And as I look out around the room for this conference, I see some previous Bociurkiw lecturers actually here in the audience, so it's a pleasure to welcome you back. So each year, this lecture is an important opportunity for the meeting of scholars and the wider Edmonton community. This year, after 3 years of online pandemic-era talks, we're delighted to once again welcome a live Edmonton audience to the lecture, while also expanding the community to anyone who chooses to participate via Zoom. So welcome to our audience, near and far. And now I'd like to turn the microphone over to my partner, Catherine Warner, who will introduce our speaker.
Good evening, everyone. It's a delight to see all of you here. It's a distinct personal pleasure for me to introduce our speaker this evening, Dmytro Vovk. He's currently a visiting professor at the Benjamin Cardoza School of Law in New York City. And prior to that, up until the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, he was the director of the Center for the Rule of Law and Religion at the Yaroslav Mudry National University, Law University in Kharkiv, Ukraine. He is widely recognized as one of the preeminent scholars on constitutional law, religious freedom, and human rights. And he's a widely published author on the intersection of religion and war. He has submitted influential briefs to the Constitutional Court of Ukraine, the Supreme Court of Ukraine, and the Ukrainian State Agency for Ethnic Policies and Freedom of Conscience. His advice and counsel has been sought by the United Nations, OSCE, USAID, to name only a few of the international organizations that have appealed to him. And I think all of that is in recognition of the fact that he is a widely respected scholar on religious freedom, and that is because of the keen insight he offers, his profound sense of fairness and objectivity, and his integrity in analyzing the intersection of war and religion and possibilities for interfaith dialogue and, more broadly, church-state relations across the globe. So please join me in offering a very warm round of applause for our speaker who will deliver the Bohdan Bociurkiw Memorial Lecture this evening, Dmytro Vovk. Thank you.
It's, of course, a big pleasure and honor to deliver this lecture, and I'm grateful to the Canadian Institute of Ukrainian Studies and especially to Professor Coleman and Professor Warner for having me. Still, I feel, to quote Sting, a bit like an Englishman in New York, in the sense that I'm probably the only legal scholar in this audience. Traditionally, Ukrainian religious studies have been significantly more interested in political and social aspects of church-state relations than in their legal dimension, treating law in Marxism style as a superstructure over a certain base, and not so much economic, but more politics and or ideology. On the other side, Ukrainian academic lawyers, even if we compare with the rest of Eastern Europe, have always lacked any serious interest in the relations between the church and the state. However, the expected or possible decision to prohibit the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, historically and ecclesiastically affiliated with the Russian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate, which is the main topic of my lecture, would be a legal decision and therefore must be based on relevant legal and human rights arguments, not just political considerations or moral claims. In addition, the religious freedom and national security is one of difficult questions of human rights law, and as the Ukrainian state utilizes it for the justification of the ban, it makes sense to take a closer look at it, especially given that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church case is unique for the post-World War II Europe, because usually security concerns are addressed towards small, closed, radical religious communities rather than big traditional churches. Finally, Stephen Hawking, famous physicist, started one of his non-fiction books with the promise to explain the design of universe with just one physics formula. I'm not Stephen Hawking in any way, so I promise to try to explain the legal approach to religious freedom and national security with 3 legal norms, and not to bother you with more with our specific lawyerish language that many people consider as nonsense, sometimes for good reason. So, since the beginning of the Russian invasion, President Zelensky has regularly approached the nation with short, everyday video addresses. The address of the 1st of December of 2022 was dedicated to what the president called as the spiritual independence of Ukraine. Zelensky emphasized, "We will protect the spiritual independence of Ukraine. We will never allow anyone to build the empire inside the Ukrainian soul." Unfortunately, even Russian terror and full-scale war did not convince some religious figures that it's worth overcoming the temptation of evil. Well, we have to create conditions where no actors dependent on the aggressor state will have an opportunity to manipulate Ukrainians and weaken Ukraine from within. Religious figures here are the leadership of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, ecclesiastically affiliated with the Moscow Patriarchate. Zelensky explained that the state would not tolerate this affiliation in any form and would demand an ambiguous break any ties with Moscow, including ecclesiastical ones. Later, the Ukrainian Service for Ethnopolitics and Freedom of Conscience clarified what the state expected from the Ukrainian Orthodox Church to do to prove its separation from the Russian Orthodox Church. First, the Church should publish an official statement about the Ukrainian Orthodox Church full separation from the Russian Church. Second, Ukrainian Orthodox Church bishops and clerics should leave all Russian church bodies and publish statements about this. Third, the church should notify other Orthodox churches about the separation from the Russian church. And fourth, UOC speakers should publicly express their position regarding Patriarch Kirill's position about the war and the annexation of several UOC dioceses by the ROK. In May 2022, even before Zelensky's address, and the UOC conducted a bishop's council, that proclaimed of its, I quote, full independence and self-governance, and disagreed with Patriarch Kirill's position regarding the war in Ukraine. UOC leader Metropolitan Onufriy notified the state that he had resigned from the Russian Orthodox Church Holy Synod. He also insisted that while the UOC had received the self-governance and connection with the world Orthodoxy from the Russian Church since May 2022, the UOC has not been subordinated to the Russian Orthodox Church administratively and contacted other Orthodox churches directly. As we see from the state's later state's reaction, these steps have not persuaded the government, and among legal measures to eliminate Russia's control over Ukraine's religious space, Zelensky proposed to draft a law banning religious organizations affiliated with Russia, and to conduct a religious expert examination of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Charter to determine whether the church preserves ecclesiastical links with the Russian Church. The proposed measures signals to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and even more to the Ukrainian society that since then the state would be more active and intrusive in religious affairs in order to counteract the Russian threat to national security in the spiritual domain. This signal confirmed a significant shift of Zelensky's personal approach to the church-state relations, because previously he was pretty much neutral or even ignorant. During his 2019 presidential campaign, Zelensky was avoiding speaking much about religion, partly because his personal, seemingly secular stance, and partly in order to contrast with his predecessor Petro Poroshenko, whose campaign was constantly appealing to his role in the establishment of the independent Orthodox Church of Ukraine as a part of his efforts to counteract the Russian threat. The result of these elections proved that Zelensky's tactics was eventually successful. Similarly, Zelensky was reluctant to speak about religion and avoided interactions with religious communities beyond some formal contacts during first years of his presidency, like this one on this slide. In 2020, I wrote a short text about Zelensky's religious policies where I argued that due to supposed pro-Russian political stance of several USC leaders and cases of USC's clerics' separatism activities, if the Russian-Ukraine war continued, Zelensky and his team would have to deal with the USC problem, and for Zelensky as a populist politician, it might be very hard choice between prosecuting specific individuals for concrete illegal activity and maintaining religious neutrality, or by imposing restrictions on the whole USC and favoring the Orthodox Church of Ukraine in the manner of Poroshenko's administration. Still, even after Russia's full-scale invasion, when some members of the Verkhovna Rada Ukrainian parliament started submitting draft laws to ban the USC, the parliament speaker representing Zelensky, party the servant of the people, rejected the possibility to ban the church, arguing that it would cause the split within Ukrainian society. This shift of Zelensky approach culminated in the above-mentioned address of the 1st of December, was determined by several reasons. First, the role that the Russian Orthodox Church played in the Russian aggression. Patriarch Kirill supported and blessed the invasion, justifying it as Russia's defensive war, an act of necessity to protect the Orthodox flock from the morally degraded West. Against atrocities committed by the Russian military in Bucha, Izum, and other places, Kirill has frequently praised Russian soldiers and claimed that while dying on the battlefield, they made sacrifices that wash away all sins. Second, acts of collaboration and endorsement of the Russian aggression committed by USC clerics and believers on occupied territories and beyond. Reported cases vary from local priests' espionage and calls to the flock to accept the occupational authorities to USC Metropolitan's participation in the official proclamation of the annexation of Ukrainian regions by Putin and Kremlin in 2022. The USC's cooperation on the occupied territories comes together with gross violations of religious freedom of almost all other religious communities in the region. Third, the overall ambivalence of the USC leadership in condemning and contradicting the Russian church support of the Russian aggression. Despite the declaration of full independence in May 2022, the Ukrainian Orthodox Church was reluctant to make, or its leadership of the church was reluctant to make further steps to get recognized as an independent church and refused to ecclesiastically react to facts that of their clerics' involvement in the collaboration with Russian military and occupational authorities, claiming that this was something civil law enforcement bodies were supposed to do. Besides, the USC has promoted the narrative of religious persecutions, comparing itself to persecuted Christians or even Jews during the Holocaust, and at least officially remaining silent regarding problematic and, I would say, irresponsible steps taken by the church before the full-scale invasion. Finally, all the above mentioned resulted in the growing public consensus and political support of the restricting of the USC's operation in Ukraine. No later than in April 2022, a public opinion poll showed a 51% support of the complete ban of the church. Additional 21% respondents were in favor of imposing severe limitations on the church. In December 2022, when Zelensky made his address, 78% of respondents agreed that the state must interfere in the USC's operation either ban it, 4%, or impose a stricter control over the church, 24%. A growing public support of de-Russification of Ukraine, including its religious landscape, has also contributed to social marginalization of the USC and encouraged the state to target the church as a part of broadly understood Russian presence in Ukrainian religion. As a response to the security concerns over the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, and as a reaction to this public demand, based on Zelensky decree, the government submitted to Verkhovna Rada a draft law establishing a court procedure for the dissolution of religious organizations affiliated with Russia, which was approved in the first reading in October 2023 and prepared for the second reading in March 2024. It's the process that is going on right now. The government also appointed a religious expert panel to examine ecclesiastical links between the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and the Russian Church that concluded that the former was still affiliated with the latter. The result of this examination, published in February 2023, makes it clear that if the draft law on the ban of religious organizations affiliated with Russia is approved, it will be applied to Ukrainian Orthodox Church communities. The drafters of the law argue that the ban of religious organizations affiliated with Russia will help to reach several goals, including the protection of spiritual independence, which resonates with the President's address, and national interests of Ukraine. Given this argumentation, I further analyzed the proposed draft law from the perspective of security-related limitations of freedom of religion or belief. Article 18.1 of the and this is the first legal norm of the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights protects the freedom of religion or belief. This right includes the freedom to have or to adopt a religion or belief of person's choice and freedom either individually or in community with others and in public or private to manifest person's religion or belief in worship, observance, practice, and teaching. The right to practice religion in community that you can see in this norm, in community with others, includes the right to establish a religious organization to ensure that the religious community is able to act in the legal sphere. Thus, the denial in registration or deregistration of religious organizations constitute a limitation of freedom of religion or belief and interference in religious rights of members of a religious community, including both clerics and believers. Religious freedom, and this is important, is not just about liturgy or prayers or symbols, it's also about the right to establish a religious organization. Therefore, the government's draft law constitutes a limitation of USA believers' religious rights, and the question is whether this limitation is legitimate or not. It's not a question whether there is any limitation. Yes, it's a limitation, as the registration constitutes this limitation. The question is whether this deregistration is a legitimate limitation. Limitations of religious freedom are only permissible on the grounds specified in international human rights law. Article 18.3 of the ICCPR does not allow limitations based on national security, and you can see this from the text of this norm. However, as any other association, a religious organization can be restricted for national security concerns according to Article 22.2 of the ICCPR, though it cannot be done for purely religious reasons. For example, a religious organization can be banned for the collective support of separatism or actions aimed at forceful changes of constitutional order of Ukraine, but it's not possible to prohibit religious organizations for belonging to a certain religion only. Overall, international law standards and best practices regarding the deregistration of religious organizations are rested on the following premises. First, the state should not address the specific unlawful activity of individuals or groups and avoid targeting them for their religion or belief. In other words, sanctions must be imposed on believers and religious communities for their illegal behavior rather than for their religious convictions. Second, a religious organization can be deregistered when the majority of its members or the leadership are involved in illegal behavior. The fact that some clerics or believers are involved in illegal acts does not automatically justify sanctions targeting the entire community. Third, deregistration of religious community should not be based on alleged threats to security, but be clearly based on evidence of illegal acts by the religious community in question. And it's the responsibility of the state and it's obligation of the state to prove that these threats are not alleged but real. Finally, considering significant consequences of deregistration, and these sanctions should be a matter of last resort when other sanctions prove to be ineffective. In its current version, the government's draft law starts with the preamble emphasizing the Russian Orthodox Church's support of the Russian aggression, and I quote, numerous facts of illegal acts of the Russian Orthodox Church and religious organizations subordinated to it in Ukraine, meaning obviously the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. The draft also prohibits the operation of any Russian religious organization that in any form supports the Russian aggression and specifically bans the operation of the Russian Orthodox Church in addition to those Ukrainian organizations affiliated with this church. While the dissolution of a religious organization requires, according to the draft law, requires a court decision, once an organization is recognized as affiliated with the Russian Orthodox Church by the state Service for Freedom of Conscience, once it's done, once the state recognized it, this religious community is prohibited to have state or local owned properties in rent, or also not allowed to sell or exchange its property unless it breaks its ties with the Russian Orthodox Church and join a different religious association. A religious organization or association is considered to be affiliated with the Russian Orthodox Church if it fits one of the following criteria. One of those criteria enough to be considered as affiliated with the Russian Church. First, it is incorporated in the Russian Church, which means the incorporation in any entity affiliated with the Russian Orthodox Church. For example, if the Ukrainian Orthodox Church ruling body is affiliated with the Russian Orthodox Church, every Ukrainian Orthodox Church community is also affiliated with the Russian Orthodox Church. There is no need to prove the affiliation of every community. It's enough to prove the affiliation of the ruling body. Second, the organization's official documents contain provisions regarding its incorporation in the Russian Church. Third, Russian Orthodox Church's official documents recognizes the Ukrainian organization as a part of its structure, and the Russian Orthodox Church has power to adopt binding decisions on organizational and ecclesiastical issues regarding the Ukrainian organization. Fourth, Russian Orthodox Church official documents contain the provisions regarding the mandatory appointment of Ukrainian organizations' representatives to the Russian Orthodox Church's ruling bodies. This criteria, the law specifies that this criterion does not apply if all these representatives publicly, in written form, decline their appointment and, I quote, make all necessary acts, prepare all necessary notifications and other documents for termination of their appointment and breaking ties with the Russian Orthodox Church. The fifth criterion, the Russian Orthodox Church can influence administrative decisions or activities of a Ukrainian organization due to its ecclesiastical or organizational subordination to the Russian Church. The sixth, the Russian Orthodox Church appoints, elects, confirms, approves, or blesses the head of a Ukrainian religious organization or association. And the seventh, the final criteria, the Russian Orthodox Church adopts, confirms, approves, blesses, or sanctions the charter of a Ukrainian religious organization. From the religious freedom perspective, the list raises several concerns and questions. First, the affiliation criteria do not require the state to prove any illegal behavior the Ukrainian Orthodox Church or its communities are involved in. The fact of any form of ecclesiastical or documentary connections with the Russian Church is enough for them to be prohibited, notwithstanding their deeds. By the way, this problem is also relevant to the religious expert examination of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church Charter, exploring a vague concept of ecclesiastical connections rather than the extent to which the Russian Orthodox Church actually guides and controls the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Due to the lack of time, I will not discuss the expert opinion specifically, but I would be happy to comment on this during Q&A. Second, the affiliation criteria refer to the facts which are beyond the Ukrainian Orthodox Church and its community's control. I mean the reference to Russian Orthodox Church Charter and other documents as a ground for the solution. It's highly unlikely that the Russian Orthodox Church would ever recognize the Ukrainian Orthodox Church as independent, and the Ukrainian state seems to prefer to rely on Russian Orthodox Church documents in defining the current status of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Given this logic, if the law is adopted, it would be enough for Patriarch Kirill to give his blessing to any UOC cleric to initiate the procedure of UOC's dissolution. Third, the draft law uses terms such as influence, blessing, all necessary acts, ecclesiastical issues, which are too vague and broad. For example, the fifth and the third criteria refers to Russian Orthodox Church ability to influence Ukrainian Orthodox Church communities due to their ecclesiastical subordination to the Russian Church, and defining this subordination based on the Russian Orthodox Church Charter. This combination grants the state with almost unlimited discretion in deciding which UOC community and when should be banned, and again, it's based on the Russian Orthodox Church's view of the UOC rather than UOC's view of itself. Fourth, even if we agree with this approach, the concept of dissolution as a sanction for ecclesiastical or historical links seems to be internally contradictory. The state argues that these links with the Russian Orthodox Church makes UOC communities dangerous for national security. If UOC communities, which are not involved in any kind of illegal behavior, are still dangerous enough to be liquidated, the formal separating them from the Russian Orthodox Church won't make them less dangerous. They can preserve their loyalty to the Russian Orthodox Church informally and be as dangerous as they were before. However, if the formal declaration of the disloyalty to the Russian Church and formal departure from it make USC communities not dangerous anymore, it's safe to say that they were not initially dangerous, as this declaration can be fake or imitative, and the state is still happy with that. By the way, we see many proponents of the ban, understand this problem. The OCU, Orthodox Church of Ukraine, leader Metropolitan Epiphany, even proposes to accept USC priests only after they are passing a lie detector test regarding their involvement into the Russian world ideology. Besides the whole idea of the transition to the OCU as a way from being a dangerous community to become a safe or normal community is very, I would say, paternalistic, as it presupposes that these believers were poisoned by Moscow priests and now will be cured and controlled by wise OCU leadership. Finally, the draft law also allows the banning of religious organizations affiliated with Russia for any other, I quote, violations regarding the establishment and operation of these organizations. The draft law does not clarify whether these violations should be significant or not, harmful or not, and this potentially allows unlimited room for arbitrary state actions against the church and its communities in order to decide or in order to force them to leave the church. Drafters and proponents of the draft law specifically refer to multiple illegal acts committed by the organizations subordinated to the Russian Orthodox Church as a ground of the ban of USC communities. They also refer to the Security Service of Ukraine, SBU, having reported over 70 cases, it's now 73 criminal cases of USC clerics, including bishops, at least 2 bishops, who justified the Russian aggression against Ukraine. Those cases includes involvement into the incitement of religious hatred and collaboration with Russian military and occupational authorities. Several USC clerics have already been given jail sentences and then exchanged with Russia in prisoner exchange. We know at least 2 cases. These arguments should be taken seriously, as the systematic involvement of USC leadership and communities in illegal behavior can support the state's intent to ban the church, while the lack of evidence of this involvement can make the ban legally problematic. According to the Ukrainian Registry of Court decisions, since February 2022, Ukrainian courts had handed down verdicts in 37 criminal cases against USC clerics in security-related cases and cases dealing with the incitement of religious hatred. This includes 2 cases against a former cleric and 12 cases for the incitement of religious hatred. Usually, but not always, it's religious hatred against the rival Orthodox Church of Ukraine. Other cases involved crimes against the constitutional order and territorial integrity of Ukraine, 5 cases, treason, 1 case, collaboration with the Russian occupation authorities and authorized sharing of information about Ukrainian military forces, and that priest was traded to Russia, 1 case. And public, 8 cases, or non-public, 10 cases, justification of the Russian aggression. Non-public is, for example, sending a message. One may argue, though, that it's the Ukrainian judiciary and law enforcement system that are not effective enough to properly prosecute USC clerics and believers for their crimes. However, during the same period, Ukrainian courts deliver more than 1,800 verdicts in criminal cases regarding public and non-public justification of the Russian aggression, more than 1,000 verdicts regarding treason and actions against territorial integrity and sovereignty of Ukraine, 150 verdicts regarding unauthorized sharing of information about Ukrainian military forces, and 81 verdicts regarding the war-related incitement of hatred based on religion or ethnicity. Overall, the USC-related cases constitute about 1.2% from the whole number of criminal cases regarding the above-mentioned categories of crimes. And this is only if we include to the statistics the cases about the incitement to religious hatred, which are not directly connected, by the way, with national security, as it's usually about a USC cleric claiming that OCU is not really a church, or it's a so-called bezblagodatna, graceless church, and so on. The number of cases, and this is interesting difference, because in cases regarding incitement to hatred based on ethnicity, there is a clear war-related component, because it's usually cases when a person sharing something on social media, like Odnoklassniki or Vkontakte, Russian social media, claiming that Ukrainians are not really a people, that there is no Ukrainian language, no Ukrainian culture, and so on and so forth. While all cases regarding religious hatred, they actually don't have any war-related component. They are about harsh language towards the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. The number of cases and the fact that most of the cases dealing with verbal expression, such as incitement of religious hatred or justification of the Russian aggression, rather than espionage, treason, or violent crimes, weaken the state's argument regarding the deregistration of more than 8,000 USC communities as the only possible way to counteract to these crimes. The draft law also prohibits the operation of religious organizations spreading the Russian world Ruski Mir propaganda. It defines the Russian world ideology as and I insist that this is a correct translation. So it's not my bad English, it's correct translation. The Russian world ideology as a Russian neo-colonial doctrine grounded in chauvinist, Nazist, racist, xenophobic religious ideas, images, and goals of the destruction of Ukraine, the genocide of Ukrainian people, non-recognition of the sovereignty of Ukraine and other countries that aim to violent expansion of the Russian supranational imperial space as a tool of the special civilizational right of the Russian to mass murder, state terrorism, military interventions to other countries, the occupation of territories, the expansion of the canon territory of the Russian Orthodox Church beyond the territory of the Russian Federation, etc. And there is etc. in the definition. According to the draft law, a religious organization involved in multiply, presumably more than one, dissemination of the Russian world ideology or its parts shall be deregistered or banned. In times of the war with Russia, the Ukrainian state has a strong, legitimate interest in preventing the spreading of the Russian propaganda, including the justification of Russia's unprovoked attack of Ukraine and the denial of war crimes committed by the Russian military. However, even if we ignore the confusing and vague language of the proposed definition of the Russian world ideology, phrases like neo-colonial doctrine, civilizational right to mass murders, and other concepts that are lack of preciseness and difficult to be applied, it's unclear why, beyond a symbolic gesture, the state needs to specifically prohibit the Russian world ideology when the Ukrainian Criminal Code already prohibits public denial of the Russian aggression, propaganda of the war, non-public justification, legitimization, and denial of the Russian military aggression against Ukraine and glorification of its participants, and spreading ethnic and religious hatred. As criminal cases initiated by the SBU against USC clerics and even more against other persons indicate that the state is already able to effectively use the existing criminal code to deal with these issues, at least if the goal is to prosecute concrete expressions, not an abstract narrative. In addition, many legal systems contain provisions prohibiting public dissemination of certain ideologies such as Nazism, communism, and the denial of Holocaust. However, such legal prohibitions are usually implemented against ideologies or facts which can be relatively clearly and precisely described and explained. The Russian world ideology, for me as a non-theologian and non-religious studies scholar but lawyer, seems not to belong to them. While there is an academic consensus that Putin's regime utilized religion, the Russian Orthodox Church, and its teachings as weapons in the aggression against Ukraine, the content and scope of this ideology, Ruski Mir, remain a matter of philosophical, theologian, and political debates. Opinions vary from the description of the Russian world as a comprehensive doctrine, a cornerstone in the justification of the Russian aggression, to the denial of its consistency and meaningfulness, and the reduction of the Russian world to its superficial construction to wrap Russia's imperialistic incentives and resentment that compete with similar secular concepts of the Russian civilization, where the role of religion is relatively lower. Given the vagueness and impreciseness of the Russian world ideology, there is a good chance that application of its prohibition might be too broad and arbitrary. One may ask if the placement of the icon of Nicholas II and his family on the wall of the church would constitute the propaganda of the Russian world. Would the dedication of the church to Alexander Nevsky and any other Russian saint be recognized as the praising of Russian world, Ruski Mir? Would the statement that Ukrainian and Russian Orthodoxy have a shared tradition constitute the Russian world propaganda? Overall, at least for now, national security arguments offered by the Ukrainian government to justify the ban of the USC are not persuasive enough. First, the state failed to demonstrate that the majority of members or the leadership are systematically involved in illegal behavior. While several clerics were prosecuted for committing national security-related crimes, it's also evident that the USC has publicly condemned the Russian aggression. USC communities provide humanitarian aid to forced displaced and support and volunteer for the army. Second, the government already has enough legal tools to target concrete individuals and communities involved in illegal behavior without imposing a ban on the whole church. These legal tools include not only criminal law sanctions against collaborators, but even sanctions against any form of public or non-public appreciation or justification of the Russian aggression in any form. This legal tool seems to be effective enough given the overall numbers of the court verdicts that we already discussed. Besides, the government still has several additional instruments to communicate its concerns to the church without imposing the whole ban on every community. This includes, for example, the termination of USC's leases of state-owned property, which is already done with respect to Kiev-Pechersk Lavra, but we also know that there is a Pochayev Lavra, several monasteries, and so on, or, for example, revoking tax benefits. However, the question remains why the state wants to ban the USC even though there is no evidence of security-related threats sufficient for the institutional ban, not for prosecuting concrete individual, but for the institutional ban. And even proponents of the law agree that not every USC community or cleric or believer constitute a threat to national security. Andrei Fert explained in the text that we co-authored recently, the Orthodox Church tends to show up in public discourse as a national cultural heritage. Heritagization of religion is by no means a Ukrainian development. Unlike in other places, however, in Ukraine, the dual religious national heritage is represented as being constantly in danger. And the danger comes from Russia and the Russian Church. According to this narrative, Russia has occupied the spiritual space of Ukraine similarly to other elements of Ukrainians' public and private life. Until recently, Ukraine was full of Pushkin streets, Russian imperial and Soviet toponyms, symbols, monuments, and mosaics, the Bulgakov Museum, Russian literature and culture in school curricula, Russian or Soviet traditions, and even names of food products. Since the beginning of the war in 2014, the state adopted several laws aiming to liberate the Ukrainian public space from elements of the Russian dominance and therefore to decolonize Ukraine. From this perspective, religion constitutes no exemption. The USC is a part of Russian Orthodoxy, notwithstanding any ecclesiastical or legal formalities, because, as the state expert examination argues, the USC still can receive Kirill's blessings secretly. And therefore, the Church contributes to the preservation and dissemination of disloyal and dangerous identities for the Russian nationhood. Thus, for the proponents of the ban, the USC has become the religious other, with no place in Ukraine in its current status. The full-scale invasion has encouraged many politicians, including even the liberal part of Ukraine, of the Ukrainian political spectrum, which previously preferred to keep religion at a distance, mainstream media, bloggers, social activists, even comedians, academics of a variety of fields, and the broader public to pay greater attention to the USC and to pressure the state to liberate Ukraine from the Russian spiritual influence and reach what President Zelensky called the spiritual independence, because it is considered to be a matter of national security. These two different approaches to national security threats in the religious domain, as first, allegedly dangerous identities and belongings, and second, as illegal behaviors, determines two different strategic approaches that the state can implement while dealing with the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. The first strategy is embedded into the draft law on the ban of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Once the law is adopted, the law would legitimize the large-scale and relatively fast deprivation of legal status of USC communities. And I want to emphasize, I don't want to go into these legal details, but procedural norms embedded to the draft law do allow the state to do it on a quite fast track. This would help to deal with those USC leaders and communities that are silently disloyal now. It would also decrease the intensity of inter-Orthodox competition and obviously consolidate Ukrainian Orthodoxy around the Orthodox Church of Ukraine. This legal tool, however, would come at a quite high political and social price. The complete ban of the USC would impose collective liability on all USC communities for their desire to stay with their current church without making any distinction between those who are loyal and disloyal, who were involved in illegal activity and not. The consolidation of the Ukrainian Orthodoxy would further push the Ukrainian church-state relations closer to other Orthodox majority countries and might affect religious pluralism in Ukraine. We have already seen some signs of this development. In 2022, political supporters of the OCU, Orthodox Church of Ukraine, in the parliament proposed a law allowing only those Orthodox communities that are either belong to the Orthodox Church of Ukraine or approved by the Orthodox Church of Ukraine to operate in Ukraine. Otherwise, they cannot be called Orthodox. Recently, one member of the expert panel decided that the USC is still affiliated with the Russian Orthodox Church, said that Ruski Mir is not the only problem. We also have the problem of Eurasianism among Ukrainian religions. Being affiliated with the OCU, does this expert mean that some other Ukrainian religious communities shall be banned for their historical involvement in some Eurasianal projects? Shall the same logic be applied to Roman Catholics for ambiguous and obviously problematic statements of Pope Francis? Finally, the question remains if the empowerment of the state in religious affairs and the draft law would make the state significantly more intrusive in religious affairs, would work as an ad hoc instrument just for the UOC case. Well, it's argued this way. I'd naively say that legal regulation is always general, not ad hoc by nature, and the whole history of the post-Soviet church-state relation has proved that the empowerment of the state in religious matters usually works as one-way road. This turns us to the second strategy, which is to deal with national security crimes and illegal behavior with criminal law and public law instruments that the state already has, while simultaneously encouraging the Ukrainian Orthodox Church to be more vocal, precise, and concrete in its position regarding the Russian Orthodox Church and its role in the Russian aggression against Ukraine. The second strategy is obviously more difficult and requires a more responsible behavior of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church itself, but it better fits international standards of religious freedom and the rule of law. And I'd avoid, and this is the final point, I'd avoid frame the choice between the strategies as an interest-based choice. In religious freedom policies, we usually claim that there are interest-based choices that you can encourage the state, providing them with some interest to follow religious freedom standards. At least for now, there are no signals that the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, that the law on the ban of UOC would significantly complicate the relations between Ukraine and its Western partners, merely because it's not the biggest human rights challenge in Ukraine is facing now. Similarly, the law would not create serious additional obstacles for the European integration of Ukraine. Thus, it's a purely value-based choice that will determine the further dynamics of the church-state relations in our country. Thank you.
Thank you very much for a very stimulating lecture, and I would like to invite members of our online audience or our audience here in person to ask questions.
I have a question regarding this expert opinion that was made yes, a year ago, and which concluded that UOC is affiliated with Russian Orthodox Church. Do you agree with that conclusion? Was it ever possible to reach a conclusion on taking into account the terms in which they set the task?
This is a good question for several reasons. First of all, we know that religious expert examination as a sort of way to implement early knowledge about religion into a legal system has a quite problematic story. We know that authorities used ideological expert examinations or religious expert examinations to prosecute, for example, Protestants in Ukraine. And we also know that in many post-Soviet countries, there are many cases from Russia to Uzbekistan, from Belarus to Kazakhstan, when religious expert opinions are used to prosecute religious minorities, first of all. Yeah, the Jehovah's Witnesses in Russia were banned based on certain religious expert opinion. This is the first point. This means that evidence that religious expert examination fit basic standards of expert knowledge is of great importance. Usually when we speak about expert examinations, we speak about three requirements to this sort of opinions. First, they should be based on specific knowledge. Second, they should be impartial, in the sense that experts has no personal interest in dealing with this. And third, they must fit what we call a legal certainty, which means that they must be somehow regulated. Religious expert examinations are not regulated in any way in Ukrainian law, and this is a big problem. We have just one mention in the Ukrainian law on religious organization that it's possible to do these religious opinions, and that's all. No procedure, no requirements to expert, nothing. That's all. Second, unfortunately, I would say, I don't have this in lecture, but I'll have this in paper, that if we analyze the expert panel, I would say that no more than 2 experts, in my view, would meet the criteria of impartiality, because the rest of the experts either, I believe this is important, are publicly affiliated with the Orthodox Church Ukraine as the members of the church. Why public is important? Because, of course, experts, as any other people on the earth have religious freedom and they can be affiliated with any church they would like to be. However, when they publicly affiliated, when they publicly work with the church and publicly support the church, in my view, it creates, it at least requires some explanation from the state, because I'm actually not talking about experts, I'm talking about the state. And it requires the state to explain why the state thinks that these experts affiliated with the opposite church are impartial. Because we can have a reverse situation and think whether the Orthodox Church of Ukraine would like to have a religious expert examination of the Thomas conducted by people affiliated with the Ukrainian Orthodox Church of the Moscow Patriarchate. Obviously not. I won't go into the knowledge, but I would say that in my view, again, it would require experts in a specific field, which is canon law, or at least Orthodox theology. And if we examine the expert panel, we will see that they represent actually different types of knowledge, including religious studies, sociology of religion, and so on and so forth, and even one employee of the State Service for Freedom of Conscience, which means that, again, the state must explain why those experts were involved based on their background, because expert examination is about special knowledge, and it's not evident from the opinion that those experts have that specific knowledge. Why I'm not going to this in the lecture? Because, as I said, the whole idea that you can prosecute religious communities for ecclesiastical affiliation seems to be problematic. And everything else would be sort of the second best choice. Yes, we can probably involve some experts and have an expert examination of whether autocephaly is the only way to be independent in the Orthodox world. But it's very good for political debates. It's very good for moral criticism of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church as a part of the Russian Orthodox Church. But it's not very good for law, which is probably irrelevant instrument to deal with these identities and links, rather than with illegal behavior.
I understand you're concentrating law, but as we see in the U.S., law is respected in courts to the degree to which they interrelate with public opinion. I'm thinking of the Supreme Court in the U.S., obviously. In certain ways, has the slowness of courts to fulfill legal decisions, or the state to fill it, such as the vacating of the Kiev Caves Monastery, which has taken a long period of time, the constant discussions and struggles over churches which have theoretically transferred and received documentation but seem to drag on and on. Has that undermined general feeling that the state is being effective in carrying this out, and does this affect what you would be discussing? And then the second, I assume you're also looking at the Baltic countries and their relations and their actions at the moment, and I wonder how you see them as applying and to what degree that'll also affect European community and the West's actions.
Regarding public opinion, I would say that it's actually quite problematic when courts start following public opinion regarding certain cases. Of course, it would be very romantic to say that that courts do not care at all about public opinion. Once you have adjudication as a sort of way to catch the public opinion, what we have now in the US in a way, but it's also, I would say, more complicated. It means that judiciary doesn't work properly. You can see now that actually the US finds itself in the situation when liberals or progressives don't like the Supreme Court because it's conservative. And if the court were liberal, conservatives would not recognize decisions of that court. So once the public opinion and adjudication start intervening or entangling in such a significant way, it actually creates more problems rather than benefits. The second, I would say that, of course, the problem of Ukrainian state on local level regarding communities, the documents and so on, that the state is very weak. At this point, I have never seen any attempts of the state to interfere in any conflict. We see several situations when there is a evident violence. We don't really understand the source of that violence over the churches, but we don't see any response to the state. We see policemen staying in front of the church and observing what's going on until people just are done, until somebody who is stronger just do whatever they want to do. And it's a big problem, right? Because the state probably does not feel enough strength and legitimacy to intervene. especially to intervene on unpopular side, because I would say the cases are different. We don't have like 100% of cases when communities would like to join the Orthodox Church of Ukraine and USC priests would like to stop them. We have different communities. We have 60 against, 64 and 40 against. We have many situations when instead of religious community, it's a community of a certain village or certain city, and local authorities encourages them to approve certain decision. Is it good or bad? I would say that yes, it's a problem. And instead of doing what the state is doing now, the state can propose some legal decisions of the situation. For example, impose obligations of religious communities to have a certain list of the believers, or somehow regulate in their charter who is the believer. Courts then, it would be much easier, because the biggest problem, as you probably know better than me, that the biggest problem with Orthodox communities, that is very, very, very unclear who is the believer and who is not. And there are many problems. I don't want to go into that. Regarding the Baltic states, we actually don't have like similar approach. Every Baltic state constitutes its own approach. We have Estonia that recently revoked the permit for permanent residential of Metropolitan Evgeny, but still there is a church affiliated with the Moscow Patriarchate, and they have some support from the Lutheran Church that probably would like to avoid such a significant interference from the state. We have Latvia, where the Orthodox Church previously affiliated with the Moscow Patriarchate claimed autocephaly, and they now implemented to their charter that they are an autocephalous church, and nobody knows what does it mean because nobody recognized them in their status. And we have Lithuania, which has tried to do some religious diplomacy to both stay in the country and preserve links with the Moscow Patriarchate. And I would say that it actually works in a different way. I would say that our law would be a signal to Baltic states what they are going to do with the Moscow Patriarchate, not their experience to us. Our law would be a way they might go or might not.
So we have a question from Andriy Kravchuk. It's a two-part question. So firstly, considering that individual parishes or eparchies are legal entities and not the church as a whole, how could an institutional ban be implemented? And secondly, regarding loyalty or disloyalty to the state, are there no criteria regarding the flow of money with Russia, and what about patterns of collaboration in occupied territories of Ukraine?
Regarding the institutional ban, yes, it's obviously a problem because every USC entity is a separate legal person, legal entity. The state would require to submit more or less 8,000 lawsuits to ban the whole church. But first, the draft law that we have for now empowers regional offices of Prosecutor General to support the state in these lawsuits. It's a big number of lawyers that can work on that. And I'm sure that they more or less can submit 8,000 lawsuits on a quite fast track. And second, the law prescribes an interesting provision regarding that all these lawsuits must be considered in one court, which is Kyiv Appellate Court in Ukraine, which means that every religious community will have to go to Kyiv in order to be represented in that court. And I would say it might be quite problematic for them to do this, or for the whole church, because when you have 8,000 cases, I'm not claiming that it will be the strategy the state will follow. Maybe the state would like to dissolve or liquidate just ruling bodies. But at least the law provides the state with these opportunities. Regarding loyalty, of course, flowing of money is an important factor in this situation. But this is what I'm trying to explain. If the state has enough evidence of flowing money, of direct guidance provided by the Russian Orthodox Church to the Ukrainian Orthodox Church or its leadership, there is no problem. Those evidences must be demonstrated, and this is, I would say, will make the position of the state much stronger. But the thing is that this, the whole wave of this surveillance and searches started in more or less October 2022. And for now, we have 37 verdicts, and most of them about verbal expressions.
If we look at the history of the Russian Orthodox Church, I still have difficulty in understanding which god Andriy Bohdan is alleged to have loved, because there is no god that taught that plundering and pillaging were consistent with Christianity somehow. And the conduct of their tsars and government throughout their Russian history, you look at the teachings of Kirill, how do they coincide with the teachings of Christ? And how has the Russian Orthodox Church at all followed the Ten Commandments? They've breached them throughout. So why argue in court about why not just say the Russian Orthodox Church is only a pretend Christianity and they have never been a Christian church, and so we don't want anything to do with them?
First of all, I don't think that there is any contradictions between us. Because yes, in my non-professional view and non-religious view, I would say that many of what Kirill is doing is either a catastrophe or disaster. This new cathedral dedicated to the Russian army really looks like a pagan church, a pagan whatever, and it's even scary, I would say, and so on and so forth. I do think that, unfortunately, it seems to be a moral catastrophe of the whole church and the big tradition behind the church, and so on and so forth. I'm not trying to debate that it provides many actors with a good reason to criticize both politically and morally the church and its mistakes and so on and so forth. But I doubt that all what you said about the Ten Commandments and the teaching of Christ is a good reason to ban 8,000 communities in Ukraine. Moreover, I would say that it's quite evident that we hope that the war will be over very soon. Notwithstanding with the result of the war, I would say that it's quite evident that the Russian Orthodox Church lost Ukraine already, forever. And now it's a big issue how to deal with these 8,000 communities. Because yes, there is a theologian layer, there is a political layer, there is a problem of leadership, but there is also these 8,000 communities. And when you interview those 8,000 communities, they can ask you, for example, why we are treated as the second-class citizens. Why a small community somewhere in rural area of Poltava Oblast is treated as a national security threat? Because they're not a national security threat whatsoever. Which means that, yes, the state must sort of communicate these concerns to the leadership of the church. The state must encourage the church to be more precise and to separate itself from the Russian Orthodox Church. And I'm not trying to argue that, there's ideal legal decisions that we will all have in this situation. But I'm just saying that in everything what the state has already demonstrated, there is nothing to liquidate 8,000 communities.
You mentioned that there is more emphasis placed on the Russian Orthodox Church's view of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church than on the Ukrainian Orthodox Church's view of itself. And that feels problematic. And for those of us who work in church structures, we can understand the ease of access to public statements that the Russian Church posts on its public forums and on its websites, where it continues to operate as if the Ukrainian Church were still part of the Russian Orthodox Church. I'm wondering, what is the legal threshold for Ukraine in terms of this law that would signal an actual separation outside of the declaration that was made in May 2022 that does not rely on ecclesiastical canonical language? Or must it rely on that language?
Actually, I would say that the Russian Orthodox Church, the Kirill and people who run external relations of the Russian Orthodox Church, they intentionally do whatever they can to make the situation with the Ukrainian Orthodox Church as worse as possible. It's such a catastrophe because they circulate letters to international organizations starting with statements like, we all know the Kiev regime is involved in selling children's organs. And they also prosecute the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, please protect it. And of course, when international organizations, when they receive such letters, they don't really want to side with people who claim that the Kiev regime sell children's bodies. And this actually plays against the Ukrainian Orthodox Church because it's as it is. Regarding the threshold, I would say that the state clarified what they want. They want the church to be more loud, more vocal, more public in their condemnation of Kirill and their claiming to be independent in any possible way. And I don't think that there is a sort of formal line that we can indicate. Probably there is something that the state would like to have. And again, I would say that there are signals coming from the Ukrainian state are also different. Because we have President Zelensky, who is probably not so much interested in religion and inter-Orthodox relations, and he just would like to have the situation somehow resolved, somehow done, without restructuring church-state relations, without restructuring religious landscape, and so on. Because even with this draft law, the draft law was submitted by the government. And according to parliamentary procedures, when the government submits a draft law, the government will then help to bring this draft law to the adoption. What we now have that the amended draft law was actually developed within the parliament, without the government, which means that probably president, his team, and the government is not so much interested in having this draft adopted. And the second type of signals are coming from the second level of the government, from for example, the State Service for Freedom of Conscience. They try to encourage this process and try to have it approved, have it adopted. Their goals probably, and the goals of some political forces within the parliament, is probably different. They do want to restructure inter-Orthodox relations and to somehow eliminate the Moscow Patriarchate and then consolidate Ukrainian Orthodoxy around the Orthodox Church of Ukraine as really Ukrainian church. And this is, again, a difficult situation. I mean, if you ask me whether the draft will be adopted in this current version, I would say yes, because the situation has already gone so far that it would be a big problem for the president's reputation not to have it adopted, despite the fact that now Ukrainian parliament does not have votes for adopting anything. They didn't work. They haven't worked for 3 weeks because they don't have enough votes for adopting not just this law, but any other law.
So Eugene Krupa has a question. Is this really a matter of theological expertise? I would think it is foremost about security. What is happening with civil society in terms of organizations linked to the Russian Federation?
It's a good question because political parties affiliated with the Russian Federation, they were liquidated in 2022. There were significant sanctions imposed on business. And there were similar procedures regarding so-called, it's not really civil society, it's sort of Russian state-controlled civil society. So the organizations that were receiving some money from Russia for being support in Ukraine, they are more or less gone. As I said, the difference with the religion is first because national security is more ambiguous criteria to limit religious freedom from the perspective of international law. And it was intentional because there is no national security in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. There is no, regarding religious freedom. There is no national security in International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights. There is no national security in European Convention on Human Rights. So it was intentionally established that national security cannot be imposed as an argument for purely religious reasons, which means that you can liquidate religious organizations if you prove that there are security concerns, such as flowing money, committing crimes, involved in illegal activities, and so on and so forth. I would say that this is 37 cases that we have. I don't think that it's a problem of something concrete. I do think that the problem with the USC for the proponents of the law, that they are sort of poisoned with this Russian world doctrine. And they must be somehow cured, and the Ukrainian society must be somehow cured from this Russian world doctrine. And that's why they must be banned. But as I said, this seems to be contradictory, because if they're dangerous now with no illegal behavior, their formal transition to the opposite church would not change anything. They would be still dangerous. And if they are not dangerous at the moment when they become the members of the new church, that they were not dangerous at the beginning point. It's more difficult to address these issues through persecution of concrete individuals or legal entities or communities. But it fits more to international standards.
And my question is very connected to what you have just said. You emphasize on national security, and at the beginning of your presentation, of your lecture, you taught us about Article 18 of ICCPR. The third part tell us in what cases, what are reasons when someone can ban or limited religious freedom or churches. You emphasize that there is nothing about national security there, but there is one of the reasons are public safety. And I believe that some experts in Ukraine, they would argue that this is like quite similar things. Do you have any official definition of what is public safety and how it corresponds probably with national security?
Yes, the tricky issue is that all these words, all this lawyerish language, public safety, rights of other people, national security, public morals, public health, they all mean different stuff. Right, and they all have some definitions. National security is not public safety, and public safety is not national security. And I will refer you that the basic document is so-called Syracuse principles of the interpretation of ICCPR, where all these definitions are provided. For example, national security is divided as an existential threat to the statehood or nationhood, while public safety is things are, for example, mass protests, or mass violence, or sort of coup, and so on and so forth. And once you have them, yes, you can limit religious freedom and you can ban religious organizations for committing those issues. It's a tricky issue that we don't have such cases whatsoever of public safety.
I was wondering if you could say some more about, sort of on a legal level, about the law on incitement of religious hatred. This sort of follows on what you were saying. I mean, I'm really curious as to what constitutes evidence. And if we're looking at verbal expressions, what kinds of verbal expressions then are legally acceptable and non-criminal and non-punishable? Where's the line between when do words, if we're talking just words and not concrete actions, if we're talking just words, where's the boundary there, if there is one?
Yeah, it's a very good question. First of all, there is no international standard, one international standard of freedom of speech. And there is a significant difference between, for example, American approach within the First Amendment, when you can say almost everything, if no violence right after that. Yeah, and you can share all sorts of informations, including Nazi flag and so on and so forth. If it's not something like child porn, beyond that you can do whatever you want, including the Ku Klux Klan and so on and so forth. There is a European standard which is much more restrictive, especially in countries like Scandinavia, where incitement of religious hatred or any other hatred might be prosecuted, including criminally, and this could be a variety of cases, including, for example, the situation in Sweden when a local person tried to eat a sandwich with bacon in front of 3 Muslim women and in the train. And when they tried to change the car, he followed them. And once he followed, he was fined for incitement of religious hatred and harassment. It's not to say that this is very funny, it's just to say that the legislation is more intrusive. But the basic principle here, that you must apply the same standard to all. The problem of all these cases with incitement of religious hatred with UOC is that we more or less have cases about UOC and not have cases about the opposite church. While sometimes language of the opposite church is as harsh as the language of OOC, and they call each other in any possible way. The UOC argued that this is church with no grace, this is not really a church, this is nothing, and so on and so forth, while the OCU claims that this is Putin's church and blood's on your hand, and so on and so forth. And you can either, as the state, tolerate both sides and say, unless you try to commit violence against each other, because we also have acts of violence when a UOC priest kicked the OCU priest with a crucifix, and it was probably in a very painful manner. Unless you commit violence, we will tolerate that. Or you will say that, no, we will not tolerate both bloods on your hands and not a real church. But you can't do just one of them. This is the first point. The second point, that incitement, those cases that we have now, they are mostly about verbal expressions, and that's all. it seems to be problematic because the line between expressions that seems to be legitimate and expressions that are not so much legitimate is very blurring. Is it a problem to say that this is not a real church? Is it a problem to say that it's Thomas was not a real Thomas and the OSCU is a Greek church? So where is the field of legitimate critique of the OSCU, and where is the field where it could be prosecuted in criminal law way? International law has a response to this, and it is called Rabat Plan of Actions, prescribing that you should evaluate speech on case-by-case basis. Rather than imposing a general criminal ban, you should evaluate each speech based on 6 criteria. You should take into account who is speaking, and there is a difference between a speech from a church leader, for example, and a local priest. In what context, if it's just, for example, a discussion, or it's prepared text inciting something, and so on and so forth. And based on this analysis, you can either allow the speech or prosecute those people. And the fact is that before 2022, we had almost no cases of incitement to religious hatred, because first, law enforcement bodies, the police, didn't really want to investigate them because it's very difficult. Yes, you need to have expert examination, you need to prove that there is incitement, and so on and so forth. For them, in those situations, it was easier to qualify this as hooliganism. If it's a very harsh speech, it's hooliganism. Notwithstanding religion, it could be religion, ethnicity, because it could be against Roma, it could be against whomever. And those cases appeared after the full-scale invasion, when the SBU decided to deal with the USC problem. They probably think that it's the easiest way, because sometimes they can't prove, for example, justification of the Russian aggression, but they can prove that incitement of religious hatred, because all those metropolitans, USC metropolitans, they said something very offensive about the Orthodox Church of Ukraine.
So Kate Woodman asks, the UCCRO has stated publicly their support for this legislation and the urgent need to shut down all opportunities for Russian Federation propaganda. What are your thoughts on these decisions of the national religious leadership in Ukraine?
Well, again, I'm not a specialist in interreligious relations, but in my non-professional view, I would say that it's a mistake, because they do need to utilize their authority to call the state to prosecute the spread of Russian propaganda or collaboration or claims or justification of the Russian aggression. They seem to support the whole ban of USC, and in my view, it's a mistake, because the split within the Orthodox Church, while being a tragedy for Ukrainian Orthodoxy, is probably, it might be cynical, but still, it's probably the best that happened with religious minorities in Ukraine since the independence. Because it's because of the split we have flourishing Protestant communities. It's because of the split we have big churches that have no time to care about small communities. It's because of the split we have unique model of church-state relations, which is very liberal, and the legislation, at least before the war, was probably the most liberal in post-Soviet space. It's because of the split we were champions, and we still champions of religious freedom in the region. I would even say, but don't quote me, that it's because of the split we have all Ukrainian Council of Churches. Because if there were a big Orthodox church, as in Moldova, as in Georgia it's still is Orthodox, or is Apostolic Church in Armenia, or Belarus, or Greece, and so on, we would never have had such influential platform for inter-religious communication, where all religious, or almost all religious minorities are represented. And in this sense, I would say that religious minorities, and by the way, especially big religious minorities, should have some interest in a sort of keep inter-Orthodox competence going and preserving some place for sort of inter-Orthodox mutual criticism, in order not to give them some time to take a look at religious minorities and think whether they can involve the state to somehow deal with, I don't know, Jehovah's Witnesses, or who is the usual suspect for them in this situation. That's why I think that the position of the All Ukrainian Council of Churches and Religious Organizations, in my view, seems to be problematic, and first of all, problematic to them.
Well, thank you very much for a very lively question and answer period, and especially to our speaker. Thank you for bringing your legal perspective. As you said, most of us that study in this field are coming at it as historians or political scientists or anthropologists or theologians or religious studies people, and having this legal expertise has been really fantastic. So thank you very much, and please join me in thanking our speaker.